So our next speaker, Mr. Mark Halladay, is a director at the Kingston Health Sciences Center, Kingston Central Ambulance Communications Center. His background includes volunteer firefighting, as well as years as a paramedic. And he's here to speak with us about the human dimension of leadership and kind of the civilian perspective, but also in a kind of a high stress positions that first responders and dispatchers and things will find themselves in. So without further ado, Mr. Mark Halladay, the director of the Kingston Health Sciences Center, Kingston Central Ambulance Communications Center, is here to speak with us today about leadership in the 21st century and the human dimension of leadership. Mark, thanks for being here. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying your conference this afternoon. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about my transformation in my leadership style and recognizing that staff have a human side to them. So in years past, I did not look at things that way. I currently oversee a 911 ambulance dispatch center in southeastern Ontario. We have a workforce of 46 staff, and those 46 staff span 3 generations. At any time, there'd be 7 staff working the floor. And each shift, they answer about 350 911 calls. So just to put it in perspective, we have a multi-generational workforce working in a high-stress work environment. And they're all working under the same set of rules and to achieve the same set of goals. So sometimes it gets a little crazy. Next slide, please. So when you combine the fact that there's a 36-year age gap between the youngest and the oldest staff member here, that everyone comes from various backgrounds with diverse life experiences, and the fact that we all have different tolerances to stress, we realize that one style of leadership just wouldn't allow us to manage the workforce in its diversity, so that we could all work towards a common goal while maintaining a healthy, productive, and engaged work environment. So one size wasn't fitting everyone there. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this slide, 2/3 of our workforce are Generation Y. To the far right there, the average age of that group is 32 years old. So you can see from 1957 to 1993. So during any shift, we would have 2 or 3 of staff from these generations all working at the same time. And why that's so important is when we get a traumatic 911 call that comes in, it's got the potential of affecting all the different generations or everyone on the floor differently. So what happens then is the leadership, the supervisor who's working that shift with all of the multi-generations has to be able to keep the center functioning efficiently, effectively, and keep the staff healthy as well. So again, you have to know your staff and you have to be able to adjust to all the different generations and how they think and feel. Next slide, please. Typically what we find the response to a traumatic 911 call is based on these 3 factors. So if I was to survey any 46 of you on this call right now about your life experiences, there'd be a significant amount of diversity among your life experiences, some of them good and some of them not so good. So the experiences that you go through during your life and how you manage them really frames your perspective and how you react to experiences later on in your life. So that could be good or bad, but it tends to be the more experiences you've had, the more ability you are to cope and to adjust to stressful situations. Obviously, the longer you've worked in the job, the more you're exposed to those critical events, and you just become adapted to it. So something that may be a critical event early on in your career or a high stressor isn't such a stressor later on in life as you've been in the job for a while. And then we all have our own window of tolerance to stress. It's important to remember that it is very different for each one of us. Next slide, please. So in our world, staff must be able to build their resilience to stress and be able to reset as quickly as possible so they can answer the next 911 call, whether that next call is 10 seconds later or 10 minutes later. So building your resilience takes a lot of time and effort, both on the staff's part and on the leadership's part. So it needs to be a collaborative effort. This takes a lot of time and effort on both parts, and we have to work together to make it happen. Next slide, please. So you can see many moons ago, I was a frontline paramedic. Then I was an EMS instructor, and then as a manager. So for the last 34 years, I've been in EMS, but the culture I grew up in was basically, if you can't handle the job, go find another one. So that was the mentality I was raised in. I have a type A personality. My leadership style was very controlling. I was a perfectionist, and the motto that I lived by for years was status quo is unacceptable. So doesn't that make you want to run out and work for me? All right. So that changed all of a sudden in 2016. So in 2016, my leadership style took a significant change when the Ontario government introduced Bill 163, which is supporting Ontario's first responders. I'm sorry, can you go to the next slide? Sorry about that. Okay. One of the requirements of this act was that all first responder agencies in the province had to develop and submit a PTSD prevention plan for their organization. The plan that we submitted at the time was 32 pages long. And if I wanted this plan to be successful and make the work environment a healthy one, my leadership style had to change from a controlling, domineering style to one that recognized that there was a human side to all the team members and not everyone was the same. I gotta tell you, it wasn't easy at all, especially given the fact of my upbringing in the EMS world. And one of the driving forces here that helped me want to take this task on was my WSIB claims were very high. I had 3 or 4 co-workers go off with PTSD and they have never returned. So it was very clear that we had to do something and change what we were doing, and most of it was changing me. So next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the meat and potatoes. So we had to learn what made every single person in the organization tick. Okay, this was done via a number of surveys, working groups, one-on-one conversations, and I say this probably took 2 years to actually get to the meat and potatoes and drill down to how everyone worked. So how did they learn? Some people wanted just to be given the documents on a piece of paper. Some wanted PowerPoint. Others wanted to do e-learning. And then some people just wanted to be in the classroom with the teacher-centered learning environment. From a communication perspective, some people wanted emails, some people memos, some people wanted to be told in person and didn't want to be bothered with having to read and open an email. When it comes to recognition, some staff said, I get a paycheck, that's what I'm here to do, and that's all the recognition I need. Some people said that they wanted to be told in person, some wanted it in writing, some people wanted just to be told quietly that they're doing a great job, and others wanted you to announce it to the world. So, what it came down to is knowing how everybody ticked and accommodating them as much as we possibly could, which then further engaged them in the workplace. And then feedback, it basically boiled down to 2 things when we were doing feedback. It was either people wanted you to be blunt and just tell them exactly what the issue is and what needs to be done, and other people wanted the message to be sugar-coated as much as possible. You need to know what their individual triggers are for stress. That was really important in our environment. What their triggers were, how they presented when they were stressed, and what their coping mechanisms were. We have a number of employees who have a significant amount of not so great life experiences. So when we get a 911 call that pertains to or makes them think of their life experience, they've got to deal with that. So that's a trigger for them, and they've got to be able to process that trigger, turn their coping mechanisms on, deal with the 911 call, and then be ready for the next call. So some of the my coworkers who have been here a little bit a while, they're able to do that, and they're able to reset and get on with it. And some people need to take a little bit of time to process it before they can get back in and function appropriately. As a frontline supervisor, operations supervisor, so they need to know what the window of tolerance is for all their coworkers working on the floor. How quickly can those coworkers reset, and what they have to do for each one of those coworkers to keep them healthy and then keep the organization functioning at an efficient and effective level. So if one of my supervisors had 7 people working and there was a critical event, their job is to know what makes all 7 of those coworkers tick and how he or she is going to manage them should an event happen. We're very fortunate that very, very, very seldom would a critical event affect everyone on the floor at the same time. So they having to deal with the issue in a live environment, they may only have to work with 2 or 3 members at the most. And then one thing we found when we started this journey in 2016, because remember my type A controlling personality didn't build a whole lot of trust among frontline workers and management, and that took a lot of time to knock those fences down. The conversations had to be genuine. You couldn't appear to be just going through the motions and trying to build or appear to be building a relationship. They actually had to be genuine. So you had to build the relationships with staff, as well as you need to get to know them outside of work and get to know their family, because if you're spending 12 hours with the coworkers, or if it's me and I'm visiting the floor and chatting with somebody, it's not just about work every day all the time. So you need to build that relationship by helping to learn their family and their hobbies outside of work. Next slide, please. So what I have here is, so I work very closely with 3 managers that we try and keep the operations going from a behind the scenes perspective. I know what makes all of them tick. Next slide, please. Next slide after that, please. Thank you. So I know what makes all of them tick. I know what their triggers are at work. I know what ticks them off. I know what energizes them and gets them engaged. I know what they do when they're off hours. And conversely, they know all the same about me. And it definitely helps, especially when we're having to deal with an initiative, or we have to deal with an issue that we have to act upon, where some of us may not agree with each other. And I can tell you that's more times than not that we wouldn't agree with each other, but it's really good that we have that, because if we all agreed with each other, then things wouldn't get done quite as effectively as what they currently do. Next slide, please. Thank you. So my controlling style of leadership changed to one that's more collaborative. From the frontline leadership team, so the managers working on the floor, the supervisors, I had to become a good listener and open-minded, and to be able to adapt to their input. So from my controlling personality and leadership style, I now was looking for feedback and entertaining their input, and now it's turned around to I will adapt their input because they know the front lines far better than I do. That has changed the environment. They're completely engaged, the management team, and we all work very well together. There's about 10 of us, and it's simply just by me changing my attitude, working with them. And there was no magic bullet here. It's taken 4 years, and it's taken a lot of time and effort. But also, as I've learned these new techniques, it's like osmosis to the rest of the team, and I spend a lot of time presenting different aspects to the management team and coaching them, and so all of us are on the same page as far as our leadership styles go. For the frontline communications officers, the most common feedback we received from them right from the very beginning was communicate, 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 and figure out what communication style suits the employees, each staff member, and make sure that we utilize them to the best of our abilities. There's two other things: be honest and transparent. Remember, in 2016, the trust wasn't super great there, and probably the most paramount thing we heard from frontline staff was it has to be fair and equitable. Nobody can be treated better than another employee, or that you can't show favoritism. So that was a biggie there, that we thought we were fair and equitable, and from their perception, that wasn't the case whatsoever. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's the results of all this. So the change has been really significant. Remember, it has taken us 4 years to get there, and it's still a work in progress. The morale within the workplace is the highest it's ever been. I've been here going on 14 years. The concern among the co-workers, the staff, among everyone, management and the frontline staff, is significant, specifically from a mental health perspective. The labor management relations, in the last 2 years, we at every management labor meeting, we have not had a single agenda item that's contentious. I can't say that for the previous 10 years, but for the last 2 years, it has been very good. We're working very collaboratively together. The engagement from the workforce from all levels is phenomenal. The picture of the kudos board there that you see on the slide was an initiative that some of the frontline staff put together as a way to recognize co-workers for outstanding work and achievement or acts of kindness that they've done at work. And then from an operational performance, when we get reviewed, audited by the ministry on a 911 call, we're audited on 76 key components of every call. In our last quarter, 96% of every audit, of all the audits, 96% of them had a compliance rate of greater than 90% on all 76 components. That has never happened. So, excuse me, so the operational performance is starting to show. So the positivity in the workplace is now showing into the performance as well. So could you imagine going to work every shift where you had input on your operational issues, where you were recognized for your efforts, you knew your coworkers had your back and you had theirs, where you were treated fairly? Could you imagine where there was good communication among your coworkers and among the organization, and where you were treated like a human and not just as a dispensable employee? I can tell you it's fantastic. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Mark, thanks very much for that. I think there's some clear parallels that we can draw as the CAF. It's highly relevant in terms of the operational nature of what you do, the high stress situation, keeping cool in emergencies and all those same skills. I have an opening question for you. Understanding that it takes a certain personality type to thrive in either the armed forces or in emergency operations, have you noticed any sort of patterns in between generations in terms of how they cope with stress, whether some generations do it better than others, or how do they, do they go about it in different ways? And I'm interested to hear your perspective on that.
So it's interesting, the Gen Ys, typically when they start here, they're not married, or they're just married and they have no children. So when we have a critical call in regards to children, it doesn't seem to bother them because they haven't got the life experience of having a child. So we definitely see that. And then the baby boomers, we get a couple things there. One, if you're an early boomer, early meanings 60s to 64 in that area there. You know, we've been there long enough, we've worked long enough, we have experience on the job, we've seen it, we've done it, and it doesn't bother us. But the older boomers who are getting close to retire, it's starting to get to them. And if there's a child call and they have a granddaughter or grandson that's similar in age to the patient, that affects them. So that's how that works. So the earlier boomers, they're just there, they've done it, they keep going. The older baby boomers, it starts to affect them. And that Gen X group in the middle, they have a lot of coping mechanisms. So they're the folks who have grown in the last 4 years with this new transformation at work. We spend a ton amount of time with R2MR, which I think most of you may be aware of, Road to Mental Readiness, with coping mechanisms, with mental health strategies. And they are the ones who have really helped drive that process here. And they seem to be doing okay. But again, if it's a life experience for them and it affects them that way, then they have their coping mechanisms. So in a roundabout way, there's no magic on which generation is affected or not.
All right, thanks very much for that. Our next question comes from Captain Yann Côté-Baribeau. And his question is, how would you compare mental resilience from your personnel and the military, you know, within your experience? And what advice would you give to us to deal with trauma and complex issues like that?
Boy, I think I should be asking you guys that question, to be honest. We deal with it over the phone. We don't deal with it hands-on. I was a frontline paramedic, and I can tell you I would much prefer to be out in the world dealing with the patients rather than over the phone. When you're working over the phone, you are only as good as the person on the other end of the line. So sometimes that can be very, very frustrating. So I must say, from my perspective, I think I should be asking you that question. And that's probably not a very good answer, but that's how I feel.
All right. Our next question comes from Lieutenant Colonel Derek Prendergast. His question is, what do you do to build and teach resiliency in your organization, and what is the leadership's role in this?
We do it a couple of different ways. There's a lot of peer support, and a lot of that resilience and coping comes from the peer support from their coworkers. And from the leadership, we provide as much support as we possibly can. We, you know, R2MR, a Road to Mental Readiness, we have 4 co-workers who are instructors who've been sent off and trained as instructors. So we have in-house support from that perspective. We do a lot of mental health first aid stuff through the Mental Health Commission of Canada. We do peer support. We have a peer support team. We build relationships among staff, and what we've done is that we have 4 peer support staff in the organization who all have very different personalities, and that is very beneficial for the rest of the team, because there's probably only one that would suit my personality that I would go to. And we have a mechanism through the management team where if you've taken a bad call and it's affecting you, we have a process in place where we would action that during the shift, after the shift, and then the following few days. And we will ensure that, you know, we're not the therapist, so we will make sure that they have access and they get access to the services they need. And obviously the services that they access are very good tools for them for building their resiliency, and they learn some techniques.
Oh, that sounds really good, and similar to a Sentry program that we've put in place in the Army to have that kind of peer support, frontline peer support, you know, at the early engagement before the referral to professionals. And seems to have some very positive impact. Our next question, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one of the best things we did in our peer support team was the peer support people were chosen by the staff. We had no say in it. And so we made it that way, so then the rest of the staff would go to these people, right? So they were people that they wanted in those roles.
Okay.
Thanks.
Our next question comes from Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grebstad. He says, you referred to Bill 163 and the government's mandate that you develop a PTSD prevention plan. Do you find that terminology is the best to use? Is PTSD preventable? Or if one's job's description mandates exposure to traumatic events? Or do you think a better approach would be, although perhaps it's only semantic, that a PTSD mitigation or perhaps a treatment plan be the right language?
Well, so if you say a PTSD treatment plan, then the bill has failed because it's supposed to be a prevention plan so they don't get PTSD. So if you look at it from that perspective, before 2016, the province was basically, if you can't do the job, move on. There was very little compassion, to be honest, whether it's EMS or I'll stick with EMS, whether it's comms officers or frontline paramedics. So we were starting to see people, staff members, be diagnosed and be sick with PTSD, but it was not in the forefront at all. So this act has forced us to do something about it. And unfortunately, there are a number of agencies who have submitted their PTSD prevention plan. It's a one-pager, and they're just going through the motions, and they haven't carried through or followed through quite as much as what we have. So has it helped us? Absolutely. There's no question that the process that we have instituted has helped the staff from a mental health perspective. But I will be upfront and say, if we weren't forced to create that prevention plan, I'm not sure we would be in the same boat as we are today.
Okay. Our next question comes from Brian. And the question is, what were some of the perceived inequalities of treatment from your staff, and how did you handle them?
Well, like I said, I thought we treated everyone fairly. So, so being told that there was biases and unfair treatment among the frontline staff was a bit of a shock, I guess, because I thought we were doing a good job with that. The perception was that we were, I guess we looked favorably upon some frontline communications officers versus others. So maybe communication officer X had a non-compliance about something XYZ, and we didn't do a whole lot about it. And another frontline communications officer had the same issues, and we took them to task on it. That was probably the most common thing that we heard. Now, that was their perception. So a lot of times when they brought the issues forward, they don't know all of the everything going on in the background. I'm not saying it wasn't all wrong, because when they sit down and break it down and explain it to you, it's like, oh, I can see how you look at it that way. We've done a lot of work on that, and to make sure that never happens again. Now, I must tell you that treating everyone fairly and equally, sometimes if you have a coworker that's going well above and beyond, they need to be recognized, and you need to, it would appear you're treating them more favorably than an employee who isn't going above and beyond all the time. So you got to balance the recognition with the perception to make sure that it doesn't look like you're doing that you're treating somebody more favorably.
No, absolutely. Our next question comes from Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Hampton. And his question is, who gave you your feedback in 2016 that led to your transformational change in leadership style? Whether it was a superior, a subordinate, or a peer, and how can we all understand when we have been given either praise or advice to act on?
So I was a domineering personality in my management style. And when this PTSD, when this act come down from the government, and we had a significant amount of time to write the policies and get them in place. And I was sort of poo-pooing it. And one of my managers, one of my coworkers is young. He's a millennial. And he works, well, you saw in a picture of him, he's a deputy fire chief, and he is totally engaged in mental health strategies and prevention plans. And he came to me and said, we need to do this, and I want to take it on. And he has just ran with it ever since, and he's built the entire program from bottom up. He manages a peer support team. He got organized for 4 staff to go be trained in R2MR. He's the driving force behind all of it. And he's brought me along and converted me over the last 4 years. But at the very beginning, it was him driving me. So he was a coworker, a peer who just drove me into leaning that way to act upon it. So it was not anybody from above. It was an act that was handed down, and it was a coworker who wanted to take it and run with it.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Our next question comes from Lieutenant Colonel Retired Murray Beer. His question is whether there are opportunities to change jobs within the greater organization for breaks or to re-energize and then rejoin at a later date. We kind of have different opportunities within the forces to take some higher tempo and then lower tempo jobs to try to manage burnout and spread experience and things like that. So is that something that's possible within your organization?
I wish there was more of that. We are pretty small, so there's 46 of us having in my department. Now, having said that, we are part of Kingston Health Sciences Center, so a part of the hospital system. So if somebody wanted to take a break, a leave of absence for a bit and go try another job and come back, absolutely, the opportunity is there for them. We don't see that happening, to be honest. We just don't see that, to be honest. Once in a while, we will get an employee who wants to leave and go to a higher level job within the hospital, but that's probably only happened twice in the last 13 years. So unfortunately, if somebody needs a break to go and re-energize, they end up going off they hang in there until they actually are almost at the wall and they go take a break from a mental health break. So yeah, which isn't the best way of doing things. If we had the opportunity of redistributing their work and maybe having them shift to another spot within the hospital like you're able to do, I think that would be wonderful. I may just take that opportunity back. Thank you for that suggestion.
All right. Well, I'm glad this is a two-way thing then. Our next question comes from Chief Warrant Officer Bob Beaudry. His question is, like you, most of the older senior NCMs within our branch are type A personalities. And the war in Afghanistan forced many of us to adapt our leadership style to a more collaborative and compassionate approach. I see this as a big win for the CAF. And what advice would you give to some of our older and mature NCMs and officers that are either unable or unwilling to change?
That was me. It was pretty hard. It took a lot of work on my part to change, but fortunately, those three coworkers that I flashed on the screen there in the slides hounded me constantly, and once I started listening and opening up my mind a bit, I would take an issue back to those three, and we do huddles a couple of times a week, sometimes daily, and I would say, okay, here's what's going on. What do you guys think? And I would get 3 completely different answers from those 3, and then I'll go back and think about it. I used to go back and think about it, and it would take me a few days to get my head wrapped around to agree with them, because deep down I knew they were right, but I just couldn't get my head wrapped around agreeing to it and not having it my way. Now it's just that's just a normal process. Here's an issue, folks. What are we going to do about it? And we all sit down and collaborate and come up with an answer. And sometimes I overrule it, but not very often. But it was very, very difficult for me to do that. And I just had to, eventually, as a counselor said to me once, if you're willing to walk away, why is this an issue? And I think that statement was the day that I changed. Because if I was willing to walk away from the organization, I could retire. If I was willing to just pack up and leave today, then why is it such a big deal that I have to be right all the time and it has to be my way?
That's a good perspective. Our next question comes from Master Bombardier Guazu Gallant. His question is, with your many years of experience in high stress environments and multi-spectrum leadership styles, what were some of the immediate actions, techniques, or examples that you used in a high stress situation that assisted in resetting your team's focus and influenced a healthy coping mechanism for the next call?
I think a lot of it. So each platoon has its own manager or supervisor on staff all the time. And it was a lot of work. We spent a lot of time over the last 4 years working with those frontline supervisors on being able to understand coping mechanisms and trigger and coworkers' triggers and how to help do the reset. And one of the things we did, which we never used to do, but now each supervisor has their own crew. So those 7 staff members work with that supervisor all the time. And we did that so then the supervisor could build a profile on each one of the staff members that he or she works with. That was the absolute best thing we ever did. So they became a working relationship. It was a one-on-one with the supervisor and the frontline communications officer, and they learned about each other during these one-on-ones and what made them tick. And the supervisor would say, "This frustrates me. So this activity frustrates me when we're on shift." So the frontline comms officer would understand what frustrated their supervisor and what didn't frustrate them. But conversely, the supervisor learned that about the frontline ACO or communications officer. But this was all learned activity. None of us prior to 2016 had any of this. We didn't think this way. We didn't act this way. So we have managers meetings once a month. And part of the managers meetings for the last 4 years was a training session that I would do that I had to learn myself, but I would coach and mentor the management team once a month on a different aspect of building this collaborative work environment.
Oh, that's awesome. And I think many of the leaders online listening are probably getting some good ideas that can apply properly in our respective workplaces within the CAF. Our next question is coming from Captain Retired Garth Wiggle. Have you considered peer and trauma support systems offered by the Mood Disorder Society of Canada for training for your peer counselors?
No, we have not. No. So our peer counselors, all that training is done through the Ministry of Health. So and they have contracted with psychologists to do that training. So that's where it comes from. But from other than that, we have not considered that.
Our next question is from Captain Matt Walsh. Did you find any difficulties in bringing in new team members? And what were some strategies you would recommend for getting new team members to open up and feel comfortable with integrating into highly personal organizations such as yours?
So we are actually in the midst right now of a hiring spree, bringing in a dozen new frontline communications officers, and this starts on day one. And it's just the entire culture of the organization has changed. And I must tell you that almost everybody we hire right now is a Gen Y. Just that age group are the ones that seem to be passing all the requirements. and they are very, I find the Gen Ys, so the up to early 30s are very in tune with this type of environment, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. And I got to tell you, I was working with a few new staff last week in our orientation, and we were explaining this exact process and the process of peer support and the culture on the floor, and they were excited. They were just like, "Oh my goodness, that's great to hear us, or for us to hear that." So it starts on day one now when they come in the organization, and I must say it's a lot of the hiring process. There's a lot of discussion during the hiring process for them to get to the point of being hired anyway. So this starts. They're very well aware of the process and the culture, and they know what they're coming into before they're hired. So we have absolutely no problems with them integrating whatsoever. And what happens is we hire a lot based on fit as well. Fit is a big component of their abilities, and we will have matched the new hires with somebody with a personality of a current employee on the floor already. So when they come back from school and they're doing their one-on-one mentoring training, we will link them up with that likewise personality, and that just starts their development on the floor. And everyone who's currently works here, we're all of the same mindset now. So as far as mental health and opening up and peer support, we are one nice ship going in the same direction on that, from that perspective.
All right, thanks, Mark. We have a related question from Major Lee Belmore, who's here with us in the studio today, kind of controlling the back end of this. He asks, you mentioned how important it is to understand the experiences, triggers, and coping mechanisms of your subordinates. These can be quite personal stories. So what advice do you have for reaching your subordinates on such a personal level, and how do you maintain that understanding?
So it's interesting you say that. I just learned something about one of my coworkers 2 weeks ago while I was preparing for this presentation, and they opened up to me and told me stuff I had absolutely no idea about. And I have been here 13 years, and that person has worked here for 13 years, and we get along very, very well. So I got to tell you, it caught me off guard that I did not know about this. So sometimes people won't open up to me, and that's completely fine. But we have a network where the operations manager here, who really takes care of the frontline stuff on the day-to-day operations, has a phenomenal working relationship with them. So if the frontline staff haven't opened up to me or opened up to him, there's the frontline supervisor where they have opened up to. So at the different levels, there's very little that we wouldn't know about the employee, and it's very important that the frontline supervisor knows exactly what the triggers are and what the coping mechanisms are and what the window of tolerance is. It's critical to the operation. And I must tell you, over the process in the last 4 years, their coworkers on the platoon all know each other's triggers and reset and coping mechanisms. Everybody looks out for everyone. And let's say I'm a frontline communications officer coming in tonight, and I'm just not having a good day. Everybody will pick up on it and know about it before I even get in my seat. So we're fortunate that they're a cohesive group that doesn't change. The group doesn't change very often, and they have learned to get to know each other very well and take care of each other. I think we're fortunate because we're small enough that we're able to do this. On a bigger scale, it would be pretty tough. I definitely don't know the triggers and coping mechanism of all the frontline staff at all, but the frontline supervisors know their crews, and they're the ones who have to deal with it.
Yeah, and I would just say that relates to something that our previous speaker, Chief Warrant Officer Bonvie, had mentioned. One of the Canadian Armed Forces principles of leadership is knowing your subordinates and promoting their welfare. And I think that ties in nicely with that point. So there's no more time for questions, unfortunately. Love to keep talking, but we need to keep this thing on track. So thank you, Mark, for joining us. That certainly helped broaden our view, and it's always great to hear some non-military perspectives, so we don't just have tunnel vision with what we do, in uniform. Well, thanks very much for joining us.